Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on how the Chinese government is financing its way to self-sufficiency and competitive advantage in key technologies. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which researches and devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across our 15 other programs and centers. Today's discussion and the excellent report by Noor Long on which it is based have been put together as part of the Global Tech Security Commission, a joint partnership between the Global China Hub and the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue, and which is designed to rally like-minded countries and leverage the innovation of the private sector to develop trusted technologies and compete effectively with China. And I'd like to thank our partners at the Kroc Institute for their support of today's program. Today's discussion is extremely timely. While a slew of Chinese tech companies have lost access to American technology and supply chains in the last few years, we've seen significant developments in this area in just the last 2 months. During China's 20th Party Congress last month, just a week after the Biden administration announced a new rule to control exports of advanced computing semiconductor chips to China, Xi Jinping further pledged self-reliance in technology to gain a competitive edge in China's competition with the United States. And just a few days ago, the FCC announced a ban on the sale of equipment from Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE. So as the United States steps up efforts to cut off critical technology and capital flows to China, Beijing's desire to achieve tech self-sufficiency and ensure its ability to become a state-led techno superpower is greater than ever. In this context, the Chinese government is consolidating its influence in both its domestic market and overseas markets where Chinese firms are active, while simultaneously mobilizing the public, private, and public-private investment to maintain control over innovation. China has recognized for many years that for its tech giants, such as Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent, to compete globally with multinational corporations in new and emerging high-tech fields, it has to balance state backing with private sector innovation and resources. A number of its financial mechanisms have already spanned decades, but others have emerged recently. So what sort of financing vehicles and actors will the Chinese government call upon as part of a whole-of-nation approach to achieve tech self-reliance and advance its innovation system in years to come? And how should the United States and our allies respond and remain competitive across a range of rapidly changing critical and strategic industries? These are just some of the questions that we're going to hope to tackle today. To discuss these issues and more, I'd like to first introduce our report author, our very own Noor Long, who's a non-resident fellow with the Global China Hub and a research analyst with Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she focuses on China's science and technology ecosystem, artificial intelligence investment trends, and AI diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific region. Previously, Noor worked at the Center for American Progress, where she researched China's industrial policy and 5G. Joining us from Berlin, we also have Alexander Brown, who's an analyst with the Mercator Institute for China Studies. His research focuses on industrial policy and foreign economic policy. Before joining Merix, he was an associate consultant and project consultant at APCO Worldwide, and his most recent piece is titled Net Zero Europe Risks a Heavy Dependence on China, which explores how the EU's attempts to end its dependence on Russian fossil fuels are causing it to shift its reliance over to China's green supply chains. Next, we have my good friend Gerard DePippo, who's a senior fellow with the economics program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gerard joined CSIS after nearly 11 years in the U.S. intelligence community, where I had the good fortune of working with him. And from 2018 to 2021, Gerard was a Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Economic Issues on the National Intelligence Council, where he led the IC's economic analysis of East Asia. And he's one of the lead authors of Red Ink, which is a recent groundbreaking report analyzing China's industrial policy spending in comparison to other economies. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Emily Weinstein. Emily is a non-resident fellow with the Global China Hub and the National Bureau for Asian Research. And on top of all that, she also has the time somehow to be a research fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown. Her research focuses on U.S. national competitiveness in AI and machine learning technology and U.S.-China tech competition. We're delighted to have Emily here to moderate today's event. So with that, I think I'll turn things over to Emily to kick things off and to discuss Noor's new report. Emily, over to you.
Perfect, Dave. Thanks so much. And it is an honor to be here moderating such an awesome panel in the wake of the publication of this report that Noor will be talking about in just a moment. I think Dave hinted at the timeliness of this report. And I think, again, given that Secretary of Commerce Raimondo just gave a speech about the US's strategy to deal with China and the economy going forward just happened literally about an hour ago. I really think, again, we couldn't have timed this event any better. So we know that China has been pursuing this path towards self-sufficiency or indigenous innovation for at least the past decade, if not longer. People, go back to Made in China 2025, which came out in 2015. We also have policies that go back even to the Hu Jintao era, so about 2006, things like the medium to long-term plan for science and technology development, and other policies that really help to lay the groundwork for where we see China's progress and China's policies now under Xi Jinping. So although this has been kind of the undercurrent in Chinese policy for a little while now, I think everyone on this panel and most folks now can agree that Xi Jinping has really doubled down on these efforts, partly based on internal pressures. I think there are certain issues that the Chinese economy and that Chinese society are facing right now that are forcing China to try and think about how to help improve its innovation capacity and be less reliant on external forces. But I think a lot of these, and kind of hinting on that external forces piece, I think a lot of these changes are also stemming from changing geopolitical dynamics, particularly with the United States. But obviously, this is not just the bilateral U.S.-China tech relationship is not the only the U.S. and China are not the only two players here, and I think it's great to have Alex's perspective as well from Germany, and I look forward again to bringing him into the panel as well. But I think before I pass it over to Noor, I think to talk a little bit more about her top line findings, I want to emphasize that some of the things that she's put in this report are things that most people have probably heard of. Some of the things like Chinese government state subsidies, looking at some of the kind of R&D funding that the Chinese government is giving out to different key sectors. This is stuff this is not new. This is, I think, some of the same things that we've been seeing even before Xi Jinping. But I think what Noor really does well here, and she'll obviously talk a little bit about it in just a moment, is some of the newer aspects of the strategy to help finance a lot of the tech self-sufficiency efforts that Xi Jinping and the Xi government are trying to push through. So things like the government guidance funds, which Noor, I'm sure, will talk about in depth, and she is one of, I would say, the leading experts on this around the world, not just here in Washington. But the government guidance funds are a really interesting piece, as well as some of the emphasis on the private sector. And I know folks tend to, I get very different reactions when I talk about the private sector in the context of China, depending on who I'm talking to. I think a lot of the times we tend to mirror image, particularly in the US, we tend to assume that the private sector in China is similar to the private sector that we have here in the US. And although there are plenty of similarities, I think there are also lots of differences, and it's less to do with the companies themselves and more to do with the system in which these companies sit. And I think Noor talks a little bit about that and can talk more about kind of the system behind the private sector in China, and how that is being leveraged and utilized to benefit some of the efforts for tech self-sufficiency. So with that, I will pass it over to Noor and let her give some top level findings, and we will then go and bring in our two other distinguished panelists. So Noor, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. And this is a very important topic given what's happening right now in China. And, the ambitions that both Dave and Emily had mentioned, to achieve this end, Beijing is really trying to push forward for tech development, and it's also really key to building national capabilities and competing with the US and other powers as well. So for this particular paper, I was really curious about, what kind of ambition, what this ambition actually looks like in practice. And to understand this, I explore three different areas where China is mobilizing different actors to finance its tech development. One, by ramping up public funding in the form of targeted R&D subsidies and funding, and also other direct state subsidies that we've seen as well. And two, by leveraging private capital in both the public equity and private equity markets. And three, finally, by merging public and private capital via the funding mechanism that you mentioned, Emily, government guidance funds. And so I'll quickly go over some of these points just to set the stage for the discussion later. We have a great panelist here, panel here. So first, in the public funding space, the Chinese government is really cognizant of the importance of fundamental research in achieving any technological breakthrough, right? And doing this really requires massive amounts of capital. So to funnel more and more state capital into research, we see that the Chinese government started to reform, some of the public funding mechanisms and also establish other new ones. For example, 2 national research programs were absorbed by the national key R&D programs, which in 2018 actually spent $3 billion alone in AI-related projects, right? And at the same time, new initiatives are springing up. For example, the Little Giants initiative became a nationwide effort to really mobilize and support small and medium-sized companies. And as of this year, there are nearly 9,000 Little Giants already nominated, and they're going to receive about $1.4 billion from the Chinese government over the next 3 to 4 years. But again, there's a lot of the high technology development is happening in the private sector. And so my second point here is that the Chinese government is trying to traffic control private capital flows into productive sectors like emerging technology. And so in the public equity markets, we see more and more state capital in publicly traded companies. Take the STAR market for an example. It was established to be a rival to our NASDAQ, the US NASDAQ, and it already has listed a lot of chip, AI, and biotech companies like the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, or SMIC. And that company also has attracted a lot of investment from the big fund, which is not a form of government guidance fund, right? And in the private equity markets, we see that the Chinese state is also trying to guide and control capital flows in this space. Beijing is doing so directly and indirectly, right? We see that the government can insert party cells and other state-affiliated employees in these investment firms. It can also signal to investors, right, which are the priority sectors that are best aligned with government interests. And so, and here I should mention that doing this doesn't really mean that the Chinese government is trying to isolate the Chinese capital markets from the rest of the world, right? We're just seeing greater state control of capital, both the domestic and foreign ones. And regardless of government's intention, if foreign investors are increasingly concerned about the state of the Chinese markets and they're leaving, the Chinese government might actually end up insulating Chinese capital markets anyway. So, and finally, given the benefits that I've laid out from both the public and private capital, the Chinese state really saw the need to bring together both the public and private capital using the mechanism, as mentioned before, government guidance funds, right? And these funds are meant to provide patient capital for long-term investment in high-risk, high-reward companies like startups and in emerging technology. So when we take a look at the mechanism, we see that there's state presence in all stages of the funding process, right? First, at the establishment stage, we see that the government sponsors are limited partners who commit certain amount of money to the fund itself. And second, at the fundraising stage, we see that some of the private investors, what they call it social capital investors, are participating in the funds as well, and they are often state-affiliated entities. And finally, at the investment stage, general partners who often make investment decisions are actually often established by government agencies, or they are government employees themselves. So, and with that, guidance funds are not without challenges. Like there are plenty. For example, these funds don't always meet their fundraising goals. Right, and so this brings me to my final point. In the paper, I looked at instances where we see successes and shortcomings of these funding vehicles, and also some areas to monitor going forward. And in terms of successes, some of them are actually happening in the chip sector, right? After a lot of state funding and private investment, the Chinese semiconductor industry actually did grab a little more global market share. But ultimately, the whole industry is still multiple generations behind that of the US. And still, we see challenges. Money cannot buy everything. So there are other areas of the innovation ecosystem that are still lacking. For instance, we see issues of streamlining the innovation process and cultivating top-tier talents. But it's pretty clear to me as well that Xi Jinping is not going to scale down the funding size anytime soon, right? He still emphasizes the importance of investment in securing the country. So with that, I'll close with this. Like you said, Emily, with more targeted actions like the one taken by the Biden administration, like the export controls and potential investment screening regimes in the future, Beijing is feeling a much more greater sense of urgency to achieve that self-sufficiency in technology, right? And from the Party Congress that we saw last month as well, it's pretty clear that China is on the trajectory. That means more state control in the overall innovation system. And with some successes here and there, the financing mechanisms that I discussed today, backed by the state, will probably be here to stay. And they're becoming important tools for China to attain self-reliance in technology, as it appears that it's going to be a matter of regime survival. So with all of this, I only did just scratch the surface here. So we have other great panelists here whose work, also touches on these areas as well. So I very much look forward to the discussion that we're going to have.
No, Nora, thank you so much for that high level overview. And I know you say you just touched the surface here, but if this is touching the surface, then the surface is much deeper than we all expected. I also think that what you've done here, and I hope for those listening too, that this is an opportunity for folks to see some of the kind of some of these topics that are worth delving into in addition to some of the work that Nora has done already. So hopefully this is inspiring some folks who are interested in delving into some of these topics in a more in-depth fashion. I wanted to point out one or two really interesting points before I turn it over to ask a couple questions to the panel here. But one of the things that's super interesting, if you go through the paper and you look at all of these different, you lay out R&D funding, direct state subsidies, all of these different things. If you look in every single instance, you see a repetition of the same types of technologies that are being invested in by these different resources. So in terms of understanding the broad Chinese industrial policy, you're able to see kind of how this money, how this broad financing strategy is really being honed to those specific sectors. I mean, I think I highlighted again, semiconductors, I highlighted automobiles, I highlighted software, AI, like a bunch of different times. And again, we see this pattern as we go through the Chinese government has, again, they've decided that these are the key things they want to invest in. And here is how they're going about doing that, or here are the things that they want to improve in, and here's how they're going about doing that. The other interesting piece that I wanted to point out, and this could also turn into a topic for the panel to discuss as well. But there's a very interesting balance here that I'm seeing in terms of the Chinese government strategy, where you see the Chinese government moving a little bit closer to the economic liberalization aspect of this, the spectrum here, with things like, for instance, the STAR market. So trying to come up with something that is equivalent to our NASDAQ, or I think the Little Giants, also the program that you mentioned too about investing in unicorns or startups directly via the government. There are some interesting points there. So on the unicorns and on the Little Giants piece, it seems to be that there's a bit of a recognition that the Chinese government is, well, they're recognizing that innovation often isn't going to happen in your big traditional state-owned enterprises. They're pivoting more to understanding that innovation often happens at these smaller, more agile startup type companies. They've studied the US system, they've studied Europe, they've studied other countries too, and they really have come to the conclusion that this system tends to work pretty well. So there's definitely that push away from the very traditional kind of state-owned enterprise structure that the Chinese government has so heavily relied on for decades, to really, again, pouring, I think you say here that the central government plans to dedicate $1.4 billion in grants and subsidies to some of those little giants. I think from 2021, I think until 2025. So that's a lot of direct government assistance to these tiny startups. So that's a really interesting piece as well. So I think, again, the broader subject I'm seeing here is this balancing between the traditional socialist kind of state-owned enterprise, very rigid system that is so, I would say, culturally inherent to the Chinese Communist Party and how China has functioned since 1949, and this need to, again, achieve this technology self-sufficiency that Xi Jinping is really pushing for. So how do you balance between the two? How do you pick, there are certain parts of the old traditional system that will stay and certain parts from the new system or from the other systems that will have to be brought in. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch how China continues to try and balance those two things. So kind of on that note, I want to talk a little bit, and I think feel free, panelists, if you want to address that, if you want to address my point there, or if you have things to add on this question. But I think, and Nora, I'll start with you, and then I'll pass it around. But I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how we go about actually assessing the effectiveness of these Chinese policies, because we all know, anyone who studied China knows that the Chinese government tends to, blunt force kind of throw a bunch of money at a sector or at some specific initiative in hopes that it will yield some results. Some of these obviously work better than others. So I'm not asking you to say, the government guidance funds are going to succeed more than these direct subsidies, but how would you even go about assessing how effective these policies might be? So Nora, I'll start with you.
That's an excellent question, because that could be someone's thesis as we were speaking right now. It's, I think these are, the question could probably be answered in two different ways. One, how is the Chinese government assessing the effectiveness of these mechanisms, and how are we as researchers, trying to understand the future of China's economic system and tech system as well, do this. And I think, I'll say that it's going to be really challenging for us to kind of like assess, what are the independent variables and what are the dependent variables, and try to draw causation. Like, say, if you, are tracking the amount of money of subsidies going into the Chinese economy and extracting what are the actual output, right? Like in the form of, economic growth or GDP and other indicators. It's going to be really hard to isolate that, because again, it's really hard to control different other variables. But I would say that that shouldn't stop us from trying to understand, instances where, for example, sectors. If we see a particular sector that receive massive amounts of money from the government and the private investors as well, and tracking over time and how much they are getting, both the either at the company level, how much they're growing, and how much, domestic market shares they're getting, as well as the international stage as well, if they penetrating other countries' economies, and much more. And on the Chinese, government side, I think they also trying to do the same thing, right? They're tracking the effectiveness, or trying to understand how these mechanisms are going to evolve over time as well. So we are seeing some ad hoc reforms, right? Like, for example, for the guidance funds mechanism, we see that once the government recognizes that there are some issues, for example, some funds are sitting idle in the bank. 2 years ago in 2020, the Ministry of Finance released regulatory, updates trying to target the funds that are that fail to raise money and invest in companies. And so I think, they are cognizant of the inefficiencies of these funds, and they're trying to reform as we are speaking here. So with that, I'm really curious to hear from other panelists as well. I think they have worked on this issue very extensively as well.
I was going to say, yeah, no, I'm very curious, Nora. I think that's super helpful. And I think you made a point too, a little bit about following the money or following these financial investment kind of strategies, almost also as a signaling exercise to look at, okay, what does the Chinese government even care about? So I think that's another really interesting piece of this. But how about I'll pass it to Gerard, and then we'll go over to Alex too.
Sure. So evaluating effectiveness of the policies is difficult for the reasons Nora said. If you look at, we're talking about tech self-sufficiency here, but really the topic is industrial policy. And there is a fair amount of literature on industrial policy across countries, not just China, that, it's pretty well known that things like direct subsidies, things that are unconditional transfers, are often wasteful. This is precisely why the Chinese government has tried to move towards a marketized perspective, which is why they have, say, government guidance funds, which is why they're using, the star market. The idea is that the market will try to drive, basically the market will pick winners for them. The problem in China's case is that the target sectors are obvious, and there's actually a pretty well-known strategy of basically front-running whatever the government says is a priority. And at a certain point, and this has happened, I think, with some sectors in government, with government guidance funds, the state becomes the market. And so you actually lose some of that market discipline. But in terms of evaluating the actual effectiveness, I mean, I think it's still fairly early days for some of these targets. But, if you looked at, say, the Made in China 25 targets, which, the slogan is no longer talked about, but it's clearly embedded in the 14th Five-Year Plan. They're falling short on most of those targets. That said, it might just be reflecting that the Chinese government was too optimistic, and not necessarily that the policies themselves are failing.
No, that's a super interesting point, especially about aligning, okay, what is actually at play here? Is it that the Chinese government, or is it the Chinese industry is failing, or is it that the Chinese government was too optimistic? I think that's a really that's an important indicator to think about when we're assessing this. But Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks also for the opportunity to join this panel. Excellent work, Noor, on the report. I really enjoyed reading it. So in terms of the effectiveness of Chinese industrial policy, I think I would have to agree with Gerard that what we want to look at are really the original goals laid out in the Made in China 2025 plan. When you look at the technology roadmap document, there are clear goals for market share in all of the 10 strategic industries which they outlined in that plan. So even though that's not being mentioned anymore publicly, I'm certain that Chinese central government ministries are still tracking this data and would be trying to increase their market share in industries like chips, rail, robotics, and so on. If we look at the more recent 5-year plans for some of these strategic sectors, it's also true that they are behind on their goals, and so clearly the mechanisms that they were using during the last 6 to 7 years have not been 100% effective, and that's why they are looking into other ways to improve their system. But beyond market share, I think the one other big objective for the Chinese government is certainly key technologies. And when we talk about core technologies, that's certainly an area where, in many regards, they have made very little progress. So, despite all their efforts, it hasn't been working so far. And I would say that these are really the core factors to consider from the Chinese side when looking at the effectiveness of these programs. It wouldn't be efficiency, because they're willing to invest almost as much as possible to achieve these goals, which are a matter of national security on their half. Yeah.
No, I think you made several great points there, but I want to pull one out in particular. This idea that you can throw a bunch of money at some of these types of technologies, whether it be AI, quantum, hardware, rail, whatever it is. And in some cases, blunt force money is going to be productive and it's going to be able to help you get to the point that you want to. In other cases, I think money is only one part of the problem, and you have to kind of bring in all of the other different aspects of the innovation cycle to actually yield any kind of results. And actually, so we do have a question, and it actually fits really nicely with what Alex just said and kind of where I was taking the conversation. But can we talk a little bit about, so obviously, again, money is a huge piece of this, but there are also other pieces that are super important. So the question here talks about, education, training, talent, experience. So can we talk, I know it's a bit outside of the scope of some of this, but I do know Noor and other folks on this call have talked a little bit about this too. What else do you think the Chinese government is really struggling with in some of these key technology sectors? Because if we take money out of the question for a second and we assume that, money is going to flow into these sectors regardless whether it comes from the Chinese government or from outside sources. What does the Chinese government lack currently within its domestic system, or where does it see itself struggling that they still don't necessarily, that they can't do indigenously? So does that make any sense, Nora? So I'll start with you. I think I'm asking kind of, if we take money out of the picture for just a second, and we'll get back to it because I know that is the focus here. What else do we see the Chinese government really pushing for to help towards that tech self-sufficiency? So just if you happen to have one in mind, Nora, I'd be very curious to hear that.
Yeah, no, I brought up two different issues that I think are worth mentioning here too earlier, which, the issue of streamlining the innovation process, connecting what the breakthroughs in fundamental research with, the commercialization process, in that process. So how did they take something that is back in the labs and bring it into the market? So that's also one issue. No, not just to say that it's a Chinese particular issue, right? Because we see that in the US and other countries as well. And the process, the issue of not just taking what's happening in the commercial sector, but also to connect it to, say, if on the defense side, military advancement is also important for a lot of countries, not needless to say. But to take advantage and adapt that for military usage is also something that really, really difficult, money aside. But I would say that, for on the other, the other point is also cultivating top tier talents, right? So China is definitely, people are aware that, and the country itself is also cognizant of that. And it's trying to attract talent from other places, bringing back Chinese overseas, Chinese from overseas to bring back to work on technologies in their homeland country. But I would say that, I'm bringing back the money into this equation because we are seeing is, ways to incentivize people to work in this space too. Like, for example, I've come across guidance funds that are used to improve talent, right? Like they are providing incentives for these people to work on a particular, technology or to move to a particular area. So, getting rid of relaxing the restrictions of the hukou system, for example. There are many different ways that the Chinese government is trying to improve the overall innovation system in general. So with that, I'll pass it to other panelists that they might have other things to say.
Yeah, other panelists, any other thoughts on what else the Chinese government really needs besides the money?
Well, I think Noor hit on the key word, which is talent. I think it's helpful to break down sectors by their attributes. So the traditional use of industrial policy in developing countries is basically to catch up to an existing technology, which might be a frontier that is not moving that much. China has done that, but that's actually not the focus of the high-tech stuff. The high-tech sectors are more focused on two types of sectors. One where it is itself a frontier, like quantum, or even electric vehicles, where it's kind of nascent in general, and China's actually at the frontier. But then there's other frontier sectors like semiconductors, which are very advanced, but the frontier itself is always moving and China's still trying to play catch up. So it's like you're in a race, but the finish line keeps moving. And I think it's that latter type of case, like semiconductors, where talent acquisition is the most important, because learning by doing is not going to give you all the edge when others are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I'd like to add something on that. And I think the chip industry is a very interesting example. I agree that talent is super important. That's certainly something that is frequently mentioned in high-level policy documents, and they're setting up many specific research institutes in China's top universities to increase the talent pool in areas like chips and quantum information and so on. But I think in your report, Noor, you also mentioned that chips is one area where China has made some advances, but I think I might disagree on that in terms of their overall ambitions. I mean, their real ambitions are to get to the cutting edge technologies, and they haven't really made much progress there. They've increased their market share in sort of trailing edge semiconductors, but they're really struggling to get into the below 10 nanometer sort of level of chips, and I think that really shows the difficulty of reaching those kinds of advanced technologies and the importance of talent. One other factor that I would also raise, which is also important, is intellectual property. And China has made a lot of efforts to improve its intellectual property system. This has really been fundamental to the way that they evaluate how innovative companies are. So it really underpins a lot of their innovation system. But their focus on quantity has really come at the expense of quality. So they provided incentives for researchers, for companies to register patents, but they've been going out and doing this, and in some cases been getting subsidies or rewards in return, but the quality of the patents aren't really there. So although in some industries it seems like China has made great progress, if you look at the number of international patents that they're registering, so those which are really valuable and they want to protect overseas, they're still far behind other countries in many areas, and this is definitely one spot where they need to up their game.
No, that's all super helpful. And the quality versus quantity conversation, I know you talked about it in the context of patents. I think it's something that the Chinese government has struggled with for decades. This is not a new issue. It's kind of been shifting through different parts of the innovation cycle. But it's definitely something to watch for in terms of some of the, I know CSET has done some work on this in a variety of subjects. We've looked at it in terms of output of STEM PhD students. We've looked at it in terms of patents in specific sectors. We looked, I think the one I'm thinking of is in robotics. We're also trying to look at it in terms of, or I think we actually already have, in terms of academic publications, because it's really interesting now that actually the Chinese Academy of Sciences over the past, I think, 6-month period was actually one of the top, if not the top contributor to Nature, which is one of the leading international scientific journals in English also. So there's an interesting trend that we see in terms of output in Chinese journals, output in international journals, specifically in some of these high-tech fields that I think can help us build out some indicators of where China's trying to go or the progress that they're potentially making. I do want to pull on one other quick thing that Robin Cleveland, who I know from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, also hinted at. And I'm curious if anyone has any specific examples of a case where China was able to successfully or somewhat successfully execute on this indigenous innovation concept. And this could be one, I would say, it does not have to be the most recent one. But if folks have any ideas of this, I'd be really curious to hear. And I while you all think for a minute, I have one potentially that is maybe of interest here. I think it's a few years outdated now, but I do think that WeChat is a really interesting example of China's not necessarily indigenous innovation, but this idea of re-innovation, or for those who speak Chinese, it's this 再创新. It's this idea of taking something that has already been innovated somewhere else, taking it and kind of revamping it and or kind of rejiggering it to like fit within what the Chinese government wants out of it. So with WeChat, I mean, I remember at first it kind of, everyone was like, oh, it's just like WhatsApp or it's, Facebook Messenger. But as it started to develop, it became much more of an innovative tool that really was working to serve the interests of the Chinese government in terms of, biometric surveillance and other surveillance tactics. But also, I mean, from a pure just innovation perspective, it is a fantastically innovative app that there was a New York Times video a few years ago that came out that pretty much showed how you could start a day in China on WeChat and go throughout your entire day, do all these chores, order food, do something for work, travel, and never leave the WeChat app. So in that sense, I would say that that is one example of an indigenous innovation that the Chinese government, obviously WeChat was made by Tencent, which is technically a private company, but received lots of support, both I would say politically, financially, and other ways from the Chinese government. But I'll pause there for a second. Does anyone else on the panel have any other examples that they wanted to throw out?
Yeah, I would, well, on the WeChat example, I would differentiate between the goals of self-sufficiency versus competitiveness. Clearly, they've achieved self-sufficiency there. Competitiveness, less so, in the sense that my sense is that WeChat is not heavily used outside of China, except by the Chinese diaspora. And so when you basically protect your internet, which they do, it's not really a fair fight. And there's an indigenous market there. So that was kind of the easier case, and they could leapfrog. The much harder case is the one where you're trying to not just achieve self-sufficiency, but also global competitiveness. I think an area where they're maybe on track to succeed is electric vehicles. And that's a combination of having a massive domestic market, a lot of subsidies, but also a lot of competition, including from foreign firms like VW or like Tesla. And I think that's the one that's probably closest to getting to the secret sauce there. And in fact, now BYD and others are talking about exporting to Europe and elsewhere.
No, I'll just add that when it's with all of these things, like the common trend is probably like these companies are looking at what domestic demands are, right? Like they're trying to meet what the Chinese population wants collectively. And so, with the example you brought up, Emily, WeChat, I also think about like Baidu, for example, right? Like it's not a fair competition. Like they did not allow, Google was not there for, was not competing fairly in China. And so, with that cut off, like there is a way for the Chinese government to, really cultivate its own domestic national champions like Baidu and Alibaba, I would say too. And in relations to WeChat and also electric vehicle, there are the revolutions going on too. So self-driving technologies and also cashless revolution, right? Like we're seeing more and more. Alipay, for example, WeChat Pay, they are trying to contain the system within its own. So the question is, are these companies going to be successful when they leave China and try to go to other countries? And we're seeing examples of that. They really trying to go into emerging markets like in Southeast Asia, for example, and they are receptive there as well. So I think the question of innovation has to be expanded broader than just looking at what's happening domestically in China as well.
No, I couldn't agree. I think that's a great point, and that kind of ties nicely back to the point that Gerard made about are we talking about competition, or are we talking about a whole host of other things? So I appreciate that. Alex,
if I can add one point,
yeah,
I think if we're talking about successes, then I think it'd be amiss not to mention the telecommunications industry. I mean, the fact is that Huawei is extremely competitive in the world, and it managed to do that partly based on its own R&D efforts. It is, it started off as a private company, is nominally a private company, but then it also benefited from the makeup of the Chinese sector, where you have state-owned enterprises which could be directed to offer very large contracts to Huawei. So there's a system within China where it can pick champions and then help them to grow and then compete more effectively overseas. And it's probably also worth mentioning in that context that, just the fact that Huawei has been blocked overseas is one of the key reasons why China has doubled down on its self-reliance efforts, as you mentioned in your introduction, Emily. I think they have already had these aims for a long time, but the deteriorating relationship with the United States has made it that they are doubling down 100%.
Yeah, we see more of I would say, a sense of urgency, it seems, on the part of the Chinese. All really helpful. Those are really, great examples. I think we could probably do an entire session on successes and failures of Chinese indigenous innovations. Someone else I want to say, someone else in the audience mentioned Renren, which is a copy of Facebook. So again, it's this idea of similar to WeChat, I would say similar to Baidu, where you see these kind of re-innovated versions of things that existed elsewhere that the Chinese government will take and re-innovate and kind of move into something that fits what they want to. And whether or not you consider that indigenous innovation, if it's going to be competitive, I think WeChat, I think, tried to expand into India at one point and totally failed. So I think that's a really important place or case to remember that, China can build up these national champions as much as they want, but whether or not those national champions can remain competitive once they leave the domestic Chinese market, I think is also a really important thing to think about here. I want to
if I could make one more point
yeah, absolutely.
on that topic, I think when we're talking about self-reliance in China, we have to remember that the manufacturing industry is extremely valued by Xi Jinping's government. So things that happen in the digital economy are already things that they can control themselves. They're particularly worried about supply chain vulnerabilities, and that's why they have a big focus on supporting SMEs to fill technology gaps in their supply chain. That's really where they're dedicating most of their resources. So I think WeChat and Renren are good to have, but they already have them. So it's not at all where they're directing their state resources.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. And I would say the Chinese government is also, the Chinese government and various parts of Chinese society are also paying very close attention to where those different choke points in their supply chain are, both at the very kind of high level macroeconomic supply chain assessment, but also at the very technical. So there you can go and find Chinese news articles about like this one tiny material in the semiconductor supply chain that only one company in Europe works in, and China, how is China trying to overcome that specific choke point? In some cases, they recommend money, they recommend subsidies, they recommend more R&D funding. In other cases, you need other things like everyone mentioned talent, you need workforce development. You need a whole bunch of other things usually. So innovation can't happen in just like this financial vacuum. You need all these pieces there too. I want to ask a question too that I think, Nora, I'll start with you on this because I think this is a really interesting aspect of the conversation on dual circulation, which is a topic you talk about right in the beginning of the piece. Could you talk a little bit about the nuances between something like the conversations around dual circulation versus decoupling? Because I do think that they often get intertwined, but they are, as you lay out, different. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, the concept is also very confusing to folks. I think they do sound contradictory. The idea of trying to balance between achieving, domestic demands and also still retaining any global connectivity with the rest of the world. That's to a lot of folks, it seems like a paradox, right? But I think what the Chinese government is trying to do is to really, to do both, right? To really get stability economically and domestically, but also to not cut itself off from the rest of the world, right? It's not trying to rely on, say, technologies from the United States or capital from outside. It's trying to mobilize efforts to do that win in first, to then increase its own global presence in other areas of the world as well. So I would say that, and I also mentioned in the report as well, there's another component that they're trying to balance, which is between the state presence or intervention in the market, and also trying to leverage private investment and other private actors as well. So I think what they're trying to do is to make them complement one another, right? Because if you this delicate balance that they're trying to achieve, if there are more state capital flowing into the market, that might potentially crowd out private ones. And that is, in a really mature venture capital markets, like in Beijing or Shenzhen or Shanghai, that's going to be really difficult for private investors to say, to continue staying there. If these state capitals are crowding them out. So I think, it's a really big challenge for the Chinese government to get it right in order to, continue implementing this dual circulation policy. And I think it's a relatively new policy as well, although it's not entirely it's not emerging out of nowhere, right? This is based on what China has been doing historically as well. So I think it's still a continuity in the policy, in a way that China is trying to play this game of, how do we not rely too much on outside influence and also our outside resources, and improve its own indigenous innovation. So yeah, with that, I'll stop here.
To
Awesome.
that, sorry, just to the question of differentiating dual circulation from decoupling, decoupling is more of a Western term, and I think it's helpful to compare what China is trying to do versus what the US is trying to do. China's three worries in terms of external reliances are technology, which we're talking about here, but also commodities and also their reliance on the dollar. The United States is not worried about those latter two for the United States. We're only worried about basically supply chain dependencies, mostly through China. So decoupling for the United States is basically limiting exposure to China. That's kind of it. Whereas China, it's much more of a defensive and all-encompassing concern because they're afraid of being cut off more globally.
No, I think that's a super salient point. I do think that a lot of the stuff. So again, there were conversations about whether or not, I remember when Made in China 2025 came out and everyone said, oh, this is China's big decoupling document. But I think you're right. I think it's much more of a from the Chinese perspective, it is, let's try and build a strategy that helps us insulate ourselves from any type of shocks that are happening in the economic system. And I think Noor talks about that in the paper, about how a lot of these efforts are they're more defensive in nature, although they may be received as offensive by folks in the United States or in Europe and other places. So it's kind of an issue of perception here, I think, as well. Alex, do you have any thoughts on dual circulation or decoupling or anything like that before I move on to the next question?
Just briefly, I would agree that it is definitely a defensive strategy, but I think the long-term message for foreign firms in China is a concerning one, because essentially what they're saying is, we want to stay connected to the world for as long as it suits us. And once we have our own capabilities, you guys can go home. So it's not a good long-term message for foreign firms, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, going back to perception. Noor, did you want to add something?
Yes, can I clarify here too as well? I think probably in the moment right now, it does seem like a defensive strategy, but I think China also has the Chinese government also has a long-term perception of what's it's going to actualize in the future, and I think in the long term, increasing its global presence is also one of its ambitions, and so I think for dual circulation, it is trying to fit in the other piece that that is not probably most relevant right now for China, but I think we can't just completely take it out of the equation. So with that, I'll leave it here.
No, just because something starts off with kind of defensive concepts in mind doesn't mean that it stays that way. So I think these things the Chinese government will work to mold them with whatever kind of strategy and whatever the geopolitical landscape, or wherever the geopolitical landscape takes them. So we can see kind of how where they take this. But again, to Noor's point too, the Chinese government is so excellent at long-term planning. You got 5-year plans, you got 15-year plans. They really lay this out and they really try to study where they want their industries to go. And whether or not they reach those, I would say, is another question. And that has to be brought into the calculation as well. So I think I have time for about one more question, and I think I'm going to do just this one question because it could take us on a few tangents here. But there's a question in the Q&A about the tech crackdown that we saw last summer, where, for those who aren't familiar, we saw Beijing all of a sudden going out and trying to, there were instances of them disrupting IPOs. There were instances of them trying to shut down certain companies. So this happened in both the educational technology sector. We saw this with Didi, the ride sharing company. There were issues with Alibaba as well. So the question here is, it's a really interesting one, and I'm curious to hear panelists' thoughts on this. But to what extent is the Chinese government, in your opinion, willing to throttle indigenous innovation to balance with CCP politics? So how do you think the Chinese government has, over the past 2 years, maybe since the tech crackdown, balance that, and how do you think they'll have to address this going forward? So Noor, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, this is a really important topic to discuss as well here. And I think for the tech crackdown last summer, most of the companies are platform companies, right? Like they are, we're talking about Alibaba, we're talking about Meituan, and those companies that have some importance in a way that the Chinese government is thinking about social stability. And so when these companies have a lot of influence on how the population is thinking, I think they are trying to assert or intervene there to really correct the course, right, of these companies. And so it is a little bit slightly different from the conversation that we're having here about indigenous innovation, what the technology companies are doing. These are technology companies, but they also have another hat they're wearing, right? Like they are offering services to the broader population, which is, they also have a lot of monopoly over that as well. So I think I'm trying to differentiate the difference between companies that are under the tech crackdown. And I think on the, that shouldn't really signal anything about, the Chinese government's unwillingness to support tech companies, right? Like they are still, the Little Giants initiative is saying otherwise, because these small startup companies are receiving support. And I think, they are trying to raise to the top to become, another national champion. And so I think these are two separate conversations to be had here.
This is, of course, an oversimplification, but I think it's broadly true that the Chinese government prefers hard tech and is against soft tech. The 14th five-year plan literally says that they want to stabilize manufacturing as a share of GDP, which, if you understand national accounting, means you don't want the service sector to grow, which is contrary to the development of almost every country, including China, for the past 10 years. They are definitely not supportive of the service sector in general. Things like Didi, a lot of stuff that was, say, be coming out of Silicon Valley, that kind of stuff, is technically tertiary sector, it's service sector. And what the Chinese government wants is hard technology that involves manufacturing. And yes, it's pretty obvious they're willing to sabotage investors' interests in order to get that.
Alex, any thoughts on tech
I
crackdown?
agree. Yes, I agree with what Jared said. They're definitely more interested in hard tech rather as opposed to soft tech. I think with the tech crackdown, they do have two broad goals. One is a genuine interest in protecting the rights of consumers. I mean, there are clear measures in data regulations which support that, while always keeping a door open for the state to look at whatever it wants. But then the other key goal is to assert the CCP's strategic priorities, which involves diverting more investment, private investment, into manufacturing as opposed to services, and other goals like decreasing the burdens on families. That's why part of the reason why they crack down on the private education industry. And more broadly, I think the big picture is they want to assert their dominance over the private sector and just make sure that they let them know who's boss.
Great points. I think we have time for everyone to give a final word. Nora, if you had kind of your one big key takeaway from this paper that you want to leave everyone with, what would that be?
That's a great question. I think we're gonna have to keep watching this, right? Like it's an evolving space, and a lot of these things are relatively new. And so building indicators for future observation and monitoring would be really, really important. So more projects for us.
Sounds great. Sounds like you all have some great job security going forward. Gerard, Alex, any final thoughts?
Somewhat similar, what China's trying to do is unprecedented. They are, as a middle-income country, trying to achieve, technological preeminence, at least in priority sectors. No country has done that before, at least not at this scale. It's an open question of whether they're going to succeed. My
final point would be that China's system for promoting self-reliance and financing mechanisms continues to evolve. So they're not standing still. They're continually developing new mechanisms, trying to increase the professionalism of officials, which are in charge of state guidance funds, to make them work more efficiently. There are some fundamental flaws, but I think it's really fascinating to see how they continue to tweak and modify it.
Agreed. Yeah, I think we'll all be watching how this unfolds very carefully. So with that, I want to thank everyone. Well, I want to thank our panelists, first of all, thank the team at the Atlantic Council as well for helping get everything set up. Even in 3 years into Zoom world, it's still complicated, but we've made it and we're here. And I hope that all of the folks in the audience have enjoyed this. Please feel free, reach out to Noor, reach out to Dave and the folks at the Atlantic Council. If you're interested in learning more about this, I'm sure they are more than happy. We are all more than happy to chat about this work, and Noor has worked really hard on this paper. And I think it will, like I said at the outset, I think hopefully inspire a lot of follow-on research. So with that, thank you all so much. I hope everyone has a good rest of your Wednesday. Stay healthy and stay safe. And thanks so much for tuning in.